Hello, everybody. Welcome to our workshop today, which now I'm looking for, Know Your Rights, Issues Facing Chinese Scientists and Researchers. I'm Randy Katz, the Vice Chancellor for Research. I'm also a Professor of Computer Science, and this is really a jointly sponsored event between my office and Oscar Dubon's office on equality and inclusion for the campus, but really the impetus behind this is Dean King Liu, who really reached out to Frank to organize this. The way that I've gotten involved in it is from the perspective of federal support for research, the amount of sort of compliance and investigation requirements that have been increasing because of the geopolitical conversation that's going on between Washington, D.C. and parts of the world, sensitive countries, particularly China, has just amplified dramatically over the last 2 years. If you read the New York Times this morning, you probably saw an article that 3 Chinese-American researchers at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Texas were let go from that because of inadequate compliance with that institution's requirements for sort of disclosing sources of funding and their involvement with institutions in China. The director of the National Institute of Health, Dr. Francis Collins, was quoted as saying that he expects that some number of people who are professors today will not be professors a year from now. So this is a very serious situation with respect to increased oversight, investigation, and so on. We have to remember that there is a balance between our open, collaborative environment. We believe in international collaborations. It's a very important part of the DNA of any academic institution. But we also have to be aware of the compliance issues from the federal government that we have to follow as well. So I'm really happy that we have this opportunity to have Frank Wu, who is a former dean of the Hastings School of Law, to inform us on what the rights as individuals, as faculty members, as members of the Chinese American community, what our rights actually are with respect to these federal requirements and legal investigations. And I want to remind people that this session is being recorded. So when we move into the Q&A session, it's very important for the people who could not attend but want to hear about, the good advice and discussion that's going on over the next hour. They want to be able to hear your questions. So we'll be having a couple of people pass around the room with microphones, and please speak your questions into the microphone so it's recorded as part of the visual record of this meeting. And with that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Frank in order to get this session going. Thank you, Frank.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. I'm going to start with a little bit of a parlor trick, a little illusion. 大家好，我是吴华阳，我是美国人，在美国出生，在美国长大，就是美国人。Now, some of you are Mandarin speakers in this audience, and you know that my Mandarin has really a quite imperfect accent. For those of you who aren't Mandarin speakers, I just introduce myself as an American. Born in America, someone who grew up in the United States. I'm from Detroit, the Motor City. That's my hometown. That's really actually all I can say in Mandarin. That's the trick. You see, if I only say those few words, you might leave thinking, wow, that guy is fluent. Maybe he's a spy or a foreign agent. He's a perpetual foreigner, not a member of the body politic, not an American, not someone who belongs here. And indeed, doing something like that, speaking in a different language loudly in a group, that's the sort of thing that will attract attention, even on a campus such as this, even someplace as tolerant, as open, as diverse as the San Francisco Bay Area. And that's part of what I'd like to ask you to reflect upon. Did I just do something wrong by introducing myself in Mandarin. I have some business cards that are bilingual. Is that suspicious or is that polite? Is that a good practice? Is it a political statement? If you look at my cards and study whether they're written in traditional or simplified Chinese script, does that indicate something to you? Is it a tip-off? Is it something that people should report? What I'd like to do today, and we'll leave ample time for questions and answers, is talk to you about this issue of suspicion now on our campuses here and elsewhere. I will touch upon the MD Anderson case and other cases. I want this to be concrete, detailed, and to offer you, those of you in this room who might have concerns about your own careers, whether you will be welcomed, whether you will face discrimination, bias, whether you will be able to advance, to offer you some practical tips, a way of thinking about how to navigate through this. So I'll begin with a little bit of history, and then I'm going to make 3 points. I'm a law professor, so we always make 3 points. The first is I'm going to talk about the current situation, just describe for you the lay of the land, what's going on out there. Second, the risks. What are the risks that you face if you're a researcher or at this institution, if you're a leader? What are the risks that your colleagues face, those issues of guilt by association? Third and finally, I'll turn to what can we do individually, what can we do within organizations, what can we do as a community? Let me start, though, with a little bit of a preface, a little bit of background. And this is an issue, sometimes, to tell you the truth, people ask me, well, why do you even care about this? You are, after all, a native-born citizen of the United States. You are proudly from Detroit. You really don't have that much contact with mainland China, or for that matter, with any foreign nation or foreign government. And I always explain that I care about this because, well, my parents were people who came, strangers from a different shore, in the words of the late Cal professor Ronald Takaki, and because I recognize that people don't pause and ask, are you carrying a U.S. passport, before they articulate these suspicions. Indeed, in many of these cases, it is United States citizens, predominantly naturalized, but U.S. citizens, not foreign nationals, who have been caught up in the suspicion, in the targeting and the investigations, and having their careers and names ruined. So this is not just about foreign nationals, and there is a legal distinction to be drawn here between those who are nationals of another sovereignty, some of whom may be here on various types of visas, H-1Bs and others, and those who are citizens, whether native-born or naturalized. That is an important legal distinction, and we can talk a bit about what that means for those of you who may be on one side of the line or the other side of the line. But the discrimination doesn't discriminate. What I mean is that line between citizen on the one hand and alien on the other hand may be less important than race, color of skin, texture of hair, shape of eyes. So the history that I just want to briefly touch upon is that of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, for which the U.S. House and Senate both apologized just a few years ago. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, when 120,000 people were locked up with no criminal charges brought against them, no due process at all, including 2/3 U.S. citizens, because they were deemed to be potentially treacherous on the basis of blood. What I want to mention about these cases is the recurring theme that Asians, no matter how many generations you've been here, no matter how assimilated you are, even if you're a banana, yellow on the outside, white on the inside, that nonetheless you are inscrutable, that people can't tell which side you're on. There are now Californians whose families have been here 6 generations of Asian descent. There are people who are adoptees, including many among your students and colleagues and friends, people of mixed racial background. There are even Asians whose ancestors came over on the Mayflower. And you might think that's preposterous, but that's because they're Anglo-Asian. Because of the intermarriage rates here in California, there are people who can claim that type of lineage, and they're proud of it. Yet the recurring experience for Asian Americans is exemplified by that question, where are you really from? Which signals with just the one word, the addition of really, and the selective nature of that question. You know, there's nothing wrong with asking people where they're from. When we meet someone at a cocktail party, a new colleague, well, just here, when I got here, I met a few people. You always ask, where are you from? It's a way to situate people literally and figuratively, to get a sense of, do you have anything in common? Can you play the name game? Is there someone who you know and therefore you have some affinity? But what's interesting is for Asians, when you answer, as I do, Detroit, because I still root for the Tigers, even against the Giants in that World Series a few years back. People sometimes, they don't believe it. They shake their heads. They say, no, that's not what I mean. What I mean, and I know as soon as they explain and furrow their brows, I know what the next question will be. They say, what I mean is, where are you really from? Which is a way to say you can't actually be from the Midwest after all. Just look at me, right? I'm a liar of some sort. My heart belongs elsewhere. It's not possible to claim that you're a real American. And there's nothing wrong with saying you're from China. That's what my parents would say. They were born in China, went to Taiwan, and came to the United States more than 50 years ago. It's that self-determination, though, that some of us take for granted. I know because I've asked people right back, white people, and where are you really from? And they get flustered and they say, well, I'm from Iowa, I'm an American. And that's exactly the point. Some of us get to declare our identities knowing that we can say who we are, and others are subject always to that recurring suspicion. Now, I know, too, that in Asia, there's a different conception of race and ethnicity, and one of the interesting phenomena for Asian Americans is when you go back to Asia, sometimes for the first time, to a place that you'd never seen until you were grown up, which is true of me traveling to mainland China. And there, too, some people look and they wonder if you are an American through and through, because the conception is different. But for now, I'm talking about our ideals, our principles, the civil rights that we have pledged to one another as part of the social contract. Because here in the New World, we have this conception that everyone who subscribes to the Constitution and the Bill of Rights can be an American, can be an equal, can work at Cal, can prosper as a teacher, a scholar, a scientist, a researcher. So that's the background, the Exclusion Act, which kept out not just Chinese, but eventually all Asians, forming an Asiatic barred zone that wasn't fully lifted until 1965. People don't realize that if it weren't for this explicitly racial measure, that much of California would have been much more Asian much sooner than today. And that was the express reason for keeping people out. The internment, which is just a reminder, because people have talked seriously about what if there is war with China? There are best-selling academic books written on this subject, and they've wondered, will the Chinese be rounded up? Not just the Chinese foreign nationals, as the Germans and Italians, some of them foreign nationals were rounded up, but also the citizens, as in mass Japanese Americans, but not others were during World War II. Will they be assumed, because of blood, to have loyalties elsewhere? Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, commander of the Western Defense, said famously, "A Jap's a Jap, and that's all there is to it." So that's the preface. Let me now turn to the 3 points again. I'm going to talk about 1, the current situation, 2, the risks, and 3, the responses. Let me describe the current situation by telling you about some cases. So this modern version of the Red Scare starts with Wen Ho Lee. Nobody remembers that name today because this is pre-9/11, but let me take you back 20 years. There was a physicist, a naturalized citizen of the United States from Taiwan, worked at the Los Alamos labs, had worked there his entire career, ethnic Chinese named Wen Ho Lee, PhD, like many of the people trained here or who work here. He was accused of having given away the nuclear crown jewels, the plans for the latest warheads, to a foreign government. Exactly who wasn't quite clear. He was prosecuted, held in solitary confinement for the better part of the year. The New York Times published alarmist headlines stating that national security had been put at risk as never before. This was deemed the greatest breach of American national security ever, until the case fell apart. until the federal judge, a Republican who did something very unusual, until the moment he apologized to Dr. Lee from the bench. Judges never do that, but he said that the government had misled him and he was sorry that he had held Dr. Lee in solitary confinement for an entire year, almost a year, and he was allowing Dr. Lee to plead guilty to one count of mishandling data, of having negligently taken some data on his laptop computer and taken it home with him. It's not exactly clear what he was doing. Probably, most people surmise, he was looking for a job. He was working on his resume, and that's not the best thing to do when you take sensitive classified information, but it isn't the federal offense that it had been described to be. The New York Times ultimately published an analysis of its own reporting, concluding that it had been inappropriate in characterizing this case as it did. This case didn't come out in isolation, though. At the same time, the Cox Report had come out characterizing China as a major threat, an emerging threat. This is even before the ascent of China that we've seen over the past generation. But Dr. Lee's career was ruined. It was over. That was it. He was forced into retirement. And what's striking about the case is, after everything collapsed, there was no further claim that he had done anything wrong. Never mind that we're innocent, presumed innocent until proven guilty. Nobody has gone back to saying that he gave away nuclear weapons secrets. This was just sloppiness at best, or somebody who wanted to look for another job at worst. What's interesting, though, is at the same time, there was another case. We hardly ever see this, where when you're trying to show bias, you have two cases side by side. At the same time, the director of the CIA, John Deutsch, a white man, approximately the same age as Dr. Wen-Ho Lee, was accused of mishandling data. The same crime that Dr. Lee was forced to plead guilty to, Dr. Deutsch pled guilty to and was pardoned. So his case, same circumstances, basically, led to a slap on the wrist compared to having the book thrown at you, as they say in the vernacular. So that's where this starts, but there's a long lineage to this if you really want to study. Some of you in this room are scholars. You may know that the father of the Chinese nuclear weapon program was someone who was a Chinese immigrant who worked here in the United States loyally on the Manhattan Project, helping to develop nuclear weapons for the United States before being wrongly accused and forced to return to China, whereupon he developed nuclear weapons for China. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, you see. The hounding out, the targeting of someone of Chinese descent could not have been a worse mistake for the United States. Totally separate from civil rights. It ended up creating the very problem that the United States wished to prevent. So this case does not stand on its own. There are now multiple cases, and this is something you talk, and sometimes people are skeptical. They say, well, all right, you've got one case, but what's the big deal? Prosecutors make mistakes. Well, now we have Sherry Chen and Dr. Shi. You may have seen them on 60 Minutes. They were in a program called Collateral Damage. Sherry Chen, a mid-level researcher for the National Weather Service, accused of being a spy, of giving away secrets about the location of dams to China when she took a trip there to visit her elderly, ailing mother. Her mother was sick. She went and visited, just as many of us would. A naturalized U.S. citizen identified by co-workers, envious co-workers, because she was an award-winning civil servant. She helped predict floods and save American lives. They identified her, despite the fact that she was a naturalized U.S. citizen, as a foreign national, and said that she was giving away sensitive information, prosecuted, fired from her job. Ultimately, the government dropped all the charges. They walked away from the case. So this is not someone who went to trial and had to win. The government dropped all the charges, nonetheless refused to put her back in her job. She's still fighting for her rights today. Dr. Shi, chair of the physics department at Temple University, Shaoxing Shi, an inventor, an entrepreneur accused of theft of trade secrets, same thing. Charges all dropped. It turned out that what he was talking about, the ideas, the alleged theft, they were his own ideas. There were no trade secrets. He was talking about the devices that he held the patents on, yet life ruined. He lost his position as department chair. He's still a professor, also continuing to fight for his good name. So those two cases just occurred within the past few years. In addition, Chenzai Wang. This is an interesting case. It's a very sobering case. He pled guilty, but it's important to understand what his crime was. So he's a climate change researcher, naturalized U.S. citizen, worked for the federal government, that's the United States federal government, looking at climate change. 3 successive summers, he accepted an offer to go to China to be a visiting scholar at Ocean University. Now that's the sort of thing I imagine some of your faculty here do. I know I've been a visiting professor elsewhere, including in China. And he was paid the grand sum of $700 US per year, $2,100 total. But because he worked at Ocean University, which is a government entity, as all the universities in China are, and failed, yes, he failed to report it. He did do something wrong. There's a minor transgression for which one wonders if he were white, if he were any background other than Asian and specifically Chinese, would this have happened to him? Prosecuted for federal offenses, fired from his job, and here too, the federal judge presiding over the case apologized to him. You can look up the transcript. She said, as she was sentencing him, that she was sorry that she had to do this because he was doing climate change research, very important for the world. She sentenced him to 1 night in jail, which he had already served awaiting trial. That was about as strong a signal as you could send that there was no really good reason to prosecute this person. Nonetheless, having lost his job, he returned to China to find employment because that was the only place that he could reasonably go. But the judge, knowing that he faced these uncertain prospects in the United States, said to him when sentencing him, remember, you are a United States citizen, you are always free to visit your family, to come here, to be here in Miami, Florida, where this case took place. Another recent case. MD Anderson, this case is breaking news. Researchers fired for non-compliance. And at the root, what's going on here is, I would suggest, fear, suspicion. Now, I want to be clear. There are cases, and I'll touch upon this, in which there has been espionage, including industrial espionage. All right? I want to be absolutely clear. There are cases of individuals of Chinese descent, just as there are individuals of all sorts of backgrounds who have committed transgressions, and I want to say on the record as clearly as possible, they should be prosecuted, they should be punished appropriately. I'm not defending the guilty. What I'm suggesting, though, is that there is in our system not guilt by association, an ethnic assumption that if one person of a particular background does something wrong, that everyone else of the same background, even if they're from the same country, the same province, even the same village, that they automatically should be assumed to have a propensity to do the same wrong act. That's the issue here. So this also doesn't just happen in a vacuum. There is a background here, and here too I want to be fair and lay out all the facts. So the director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, about a year ago, made some remarks testifying before the Senate. You can look at this for yourself. He opined that China presented what he called an all-of-society threat. The whole of Chinese society was a threat to the whole of the U.S. society, and there had to be an all-of-society response. And he suggested that every student and researcher of Chinese descent in the United States was potentially a spy. Now, he went on to explain that the Chinese government uses what he called non-traditional collectors. That actually is true. many governments do this. It's an effort to build up a picture from the many different small grains of sand. So instead of having professional spies, you talk to people who aren't spies. They have a day job. They may see themselves as innocent, but you get a little piece of information here, a little piece of information there. And if you're collecting for enough, and if you have a vision of the long game, if you're diligent and earnest, eventually you have enough that you can piece together something that is secret, that should have remained secret because you've gathered these little bits. That's the theory, and that's what Ray talked about. Given an opportunity multiple times to clarify his remarks, and as they say in DC, to walk back the proposition that all Chinese researchers, scientists, all Chinese foreign students were spies, he did not do that. He instead doubled down and suggested that he meant what he said, that there were suspicions that should be cast on all. Now, I said I want to be fair, and in the MD Anderson case and in some of these other cases, what is at issue is recruitment in talent programs. China is not the only nation with such programs. Israel, Ireland, many nations have sought to recruit people with ethnic affinities back as investors, as entrepreneurs, and they've offered them opportunities. They've offered them cash incentives. The 1,000 Talents program of China is one among many, but China now is perceived as a strategic enemy. You may know numerous reports have come out, ranging from government reports to think tank reports, that characterize the rise of China as presenting a threat to the American way of life, and posing the suggestion that on campuses in particular, that there are communist agents seated in the auditorium working to advance Chinese goals on American soil in some type of surreptitious manner. So all of this fits into this background, and these cases, I would suggest to you, are not isolated. The MD Anderson case is the latest. It will not be the last. So that's the first part of my talk, the current situation. So there are real cases of people being prosecuted, and in some instances, many, wrongfully prosecuted, meaning the charges are false, ultimately dropped. These are individuals who have done nothing wrong, yet their lives are ruined, their careers are wrecked, their names are dirt. This violates American ideals. Never mind what the norms are in Asia or in China. This is not how we have set up things here, and the pledge that we have made to each other, including on this campus. I commend your chancellor for her very strong statement about the anti-Asian, specifically anti-Asian bias that is now being felt. Second part of my talk, what are the risks? So what I would suggest here is that we have three different types of cases. Okay, so I'm going to characterize this abstractly, and then I'm going to talk about the specific types of cases. All right, so there are three types of cases here. All right, A, there are cases where people have done something wrong. Okay, and there are people who have pled guilty. There was a case involving the pharmaceutical giant GlaxoSmithKline, for example. There are other cases in which people have engaged in cyber warfare, computer hacking, industrial trade secret theft. There are systematic efforts. I have no doubt that there are such cases, no doubt, because I've read and studied the convictions in those cases. Okay, so yes, A, there's a category of cases where people are guilty. B, there's the category of cases like the ones of Wenho Lee, Sherry Chen, Dr. Shi, and others where people are not guilty. They're innocent. There has not been wrongdoing, but there's been this targeting. So we have a difficulty here figuring out which is A and which is B, because you need a process to assess this. That's the whole point of having the judicial system that we have, having the governmental system with checks and balances. But C, there's a set of cases that are ambiguous. There are a set of cases where our norms are still developing. What I mean by that is there's a set of cases where people have done what they are alleged to have done, but we don't have a well-settled norm, or it's changing over time, of whether what they've done is wrong or not. So, participating in 1,000 Talents programs, for example. There are activities which 10 years ago were not only not criminal, they were encouraged as part of the free flow of information, collaboration, the way science works. We wanted people to welcome foreign visitors to labs and so on and so forth. So the C category is one that is fraught with peril and risk, a category where if you had done this at some other point in time, it would have been fine, but today it's going to be looked at with suspicion, and tomorrow it might be looked at with even greater suspicion, and where the conduct for some individuals vis-a-vis some nations is not problematic. So if you're of Irish descent and the government of Ireland offers you an incentive to participate in a talent program, you participate in that program, you have contact with the Irish government, you receive material benefits, everyone shrugs it off. It doesn't seem nefarious and sinister. It's not a threat to the American way of life, right? So this C category of ambiguity, this is the one that concerns me, because as the standards change, people may not keep up, and it's why it's important that we have sessions like this so that you are aware that there is a possibility that conduct that you believed and that once you were correct to believe could be safely engaged in, that the next day it will no longer be proper and could subject you not just to employment consequences, but criminal prosecution. So what are the types of issues here? They include trade secret theft. Note, with trade secret theft, it need not be for the benefit of the government. That is, it can be a commercial enterprise, but trade secret theft, that is a criminal violation. There is violation of export control laws, including as to items that are listed as dual use. There are computer crimes. There are prosecutions for other offenses. So there are a handful of cases in which people have been accused of espionage. Massive investigations undertaken, for example, looking at every file on a person's computer. Ultimately, no prosecution for espionage, but a prosecution for possession of child pornography, for example, or for some other offense is launched based on what's been discovered looking through someone's computer files. There also is the Foreign Agent Registration Act, FARA. This doesn't even require any payment. It's when you act at the behest of a foreign government to advance its interests here. You're supposed to register. Now, this was a law that nobody paid any attention to until very recently. It's at the center of the claims of Russia being involved in the 2016 race to the White House and so on. But violation of FARA is now being prosecuted, and prosecuted vigorously, especially as to China. So the other aspect of this is there is now express targeting based on a specific nation. The Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, in one of his last acts, December of last year, issued a statement about taking on crimes related to China in particular. So it's not just espionage cases, it's all of these cases. And understand too, it's not just actual prosecution, it's the chilling effect. That's what lawyers use to refer to the possibility that in addition to facing some problem, a real legal problem, such as criminal prosecution, you will self-censor or cease to do things that are good things, beneficial things that we want to do, such as having a conference where you invite foreign guests, or becoming a visiting scholar overseas. People will withdraw, they'll pull back, and this will chill First Amendment protected activity and so on, because people don't want to get in trouble. They're risk averse. So what do we do? This takes me to the third and final part of my talk, responses. So let me suggest here there are 5 things that we can do. A is ramp up compliance activity. This is a sophisticated research university. You have entire departments and professionals whose job is to do compliance. So compliance is not easy because the norms are changing. So my first suggestion is for anyone who runs a lab, runs a program, for the deans, associate deans, and assistant deans, which is to invest greater resources in compliance and understand that compliance is a dynamic area. Any one of you receiving federal grants is already doing this, but if you're the PI, you're not the person who is actually doing it, you've delegated it. So my suggestion also to faculty members who are PIs is you might need to take this a little more seriously, because when you sign off on this, if something goes wrong, and it could just be some graduate student who's doing something well-intentioned and well-meaning, but that violates in a technical way some provision of the funding that will lead not just to loss of funds, but the end of your career and potential criminal prosecution. People, I think, don't have enough paranoia about the risks posed. So A, compliance. B, I have a colleague, Brian Sun. He's the lawyer who represented Wen Ho Lee. He has a wonderful phrase. He does a version of this talk. His has PowerPoints. Mine is old school. I just stand up and talk. Brian Sun has a phrase, though. I'm going to borrow his phrase. His phrase is, don't do stupid things. All right? And there's a whole range of stupid things you can do. And some of these stupid things, I'll be honest with you, some of these stupid things, they're not bad things. They're okay things to do. And this is a controversial area. There was somebody at Duke recently who landed in quite a bit of trouble, suggesting to Chinese students not to be in groups speaking Mandarin, right? Because that was perceived as discriminatory. Now, there's an issue there about the intent. Was this meant to be helpful? Was it said respectfully? I don't know. I'm not judging that case. I'm just saying that people should be aware that all it takes is one person who is a little bit spiteful, or who they have nothing against you, they're just alarmed, and they hear you speaking in Chinese often, and they don't know what you're saying, and you talk about your travel to China for innocent reasons, but they try to piece together something, and they infer a motive which doesn't exist, and they make a few phone calls, and the next thing you know, you're being contacted by the FBI to come in for a friendly visit. So my point here with this is understand the perception that other people have. So sometimes I'll be honest, I'm tempted as someone of Chinese descent with no prejudice, with what I hope would be understood as only a desire to be helpful, to say to a group of Chinese people, you know, this large group of Chinese people all speaking Chinese loudly here on the Cal campus is going to attract attention in a way that you might not want attracted to you, even though you're just talking about totally normal things, which I can tell with my limited Mandarin. Nonetheless, some other people might not perceive it that way, and this could cause an issue. C, organizing. Organizing ethnic affinity groups. So there are numerous professional organizations for Asian and in some instances in particular Chinese, including both foreign nationals and US citizens in particular fields, in engineering and biochemistry and medical research, and some of them are now putting out statements. So organizing for mutual defense, to share stories, to pool resources so that you understand you're not alone, that there are common themes here. Because sometimes when you encounter this, you think to yourself, well, maybe it's just me, maybe I'm just being, don't be too politically correct. Can't you just take a joke? People will say to you, just laugh it off. What's the big deal? They didn't mean anything by that. Except you talk to your friends and you realize, whoa, wait a minute. That wasn't just an isolated incident. That same person has made similar remarks 10 other times, and they've made the remarks to every Chinese graduate student in the department. Well, now that we know that, that's new information. That's different than if it's just one casual remark. It's a joke that you can laugh off. So organize to address these issues. D, participate in the mainstream. I do a separate talk sometimes where I've been asked for advice from Asian Americans about breaking through the glass ceiling, or bamboo ceiling they sometimes call it. And it's related. I talk about prejudice and bias against people of Asian descent, but also about some traits that people engage in. So with audiences where they know this is friendly advice, I always ask people, sometimes I do this for tech firms. I say to them, who do you sit with at lunch? And they reply, oh, I sit with all my friends from undergrad at Tsinghua, and we have a whole table. And I say, all right, you're never going to get promoted to manager because you just sit with a bunch of other people who you know from Tsinghua, and you speak in Mandarin, and you don't associate with anyone else, and they don't get to know you, and so they are stereotyping you because you're conforming to a stereotype. So you've got to get into the mainstream. My last point was affinity groups. That's good. Mainstream is good too. So this isn't either or, it's both and. It means participating in all the mainstream professional organizations. For me, the American Bar Association, for example. I'm both very active in the Asian American Bar Association and very active in the mainstream prestigious American Bar Association. Why? Because it's important to do both. And if people just stick to their labs and their research, that's not a good strategy. Here, I want to digress for a moment. And I'm speaking in particular, you'll know if I'm talking to you when I say this. There's some people in this room, smart, hardworking, have PhDs in their particular field. They're really at the top of their game, or they know they're going to get there because you're here at the Cal campus, you're getting a PhD, that's fantastic. But there's something that happens when you're really smart and good at doing something such as engineering, which is when there's legal risk or an issue that is outside your domain, you think, well, I'm smart, I can take care of this, without understanding, no, it's a whole different game that's being played when it comes to criminal prosecution. You can't just kind of wing it and talk your way out of it. Even if you have a PhD, even if you're a chaired professor, if you don't hire a lawyer when the FBI calls you, you're just going to make your own life miserable. That's an avoidable mistake. There's a related mistake, I think, that for many hardworking Asians that they fall into, which is to think, I'll just do better at my job. I'll just work even harder and be even more successful, without realizing that success generates resentment, and the failure to participate more broadly just makes it appear that you're up to something, right? The more focused you are on your work, it's good, right? But it is not a good strategy if you're trying to address these bigger issues, which may be a distraction but have to be addressed. So point E, my last point as to what we can do, it's to address implicit bias. So, most people these days, not everyone, but most people are too sophisticated just to be outright bigots. There aren't that many people, not at Cal, who walk around saying all Chinese people are spies, or saying Ching Chong Chinaman, or calling you a chink, or challenging you to karate fights, that sort of thing. It still goes on, right? I don't want to diminish that. There's still that sort of overt, in-your-face racism. But there's a lot of it that's very different, right? It's the assumption that you had a tiger mother who beat you if you got an A minus, that you graduated from high school at the age of 11 with perfect SAT scores. You know, it's this whole set of assumptions that you're good with numbers, bad with people, right? All these other parts of the model minority myth, that some of them are flattering and almost compliments, but they're so dangerous. So some of this is the implicit bias. We all have it. I have it too. It's the images rattling around in the back of our head that tell us who is friend and who is foe, of strangers we see on the street, who might be dangerous, when do we cross the other side of the street. It's that sort of thing that we need to address. So let me recap, and then we'll do some questions and answers. I've talked first about specific cases because I want you to know what is happening out there. These are the cases when Ho Li, Sherry Chen, Dr. Shi, Chenzai Wang, numerous cases. Most recently, if you haven't read about it, read about the MD Anderson case. If you read about it in the Washington Post, that's the story I'm quoted in, but that's okay. You can read about it in the New York Times as well. Second, I've talked about the types of risks. It's not just outright criminal prosecution. It's just investigation. It's naming and shaming. It's multiple types of cases, not all of which involve working directly for a government. So don't think that this is just about if Beijing has called you and given you instructions. Simply taking trade secrets and trying to benefit materially yourself and a Chinese company is not just a civil violation. It can rise to the level of criminal prosecution. Third, I've talked about what we can do. Again, A, compliance. B, don't do stupid things. C, organize affinity groups and organize amongst yourselves. D, be part of the mainstream and take part in that. And E, address implicit forms of bias. Let me close on this thought. The United States of America, I am convinced, and I won't hesitate to say this, is the greatest nation on the face of the globe. It has stood as that shining city upon a hill, the words of John F. Kennedy and President Reagan. It has beckoned with freedom and opportunity the world over. Our institutions of higher education lead the way. One of the great signs of our strength is if you look at the most talented people in China, what is it they want to do? They want to come here to Cal for graduate school, right? So we have this tremendous strength based on our openness. As we address what is a real challenge, let us not forget our ideals, what drew our ancestors here, or us. For so many of you who came, who struggled, who put in the extra work because you understood that coming here would give you boundless opportunity that you could not find elsewhere. And if we work together, we will make good on these ideals of this diverse democracy. But it requires that we work together, all of us. So thank you for having me. It's truly been an honor to visit here at Cal. Thank you. We have time for a few questions. Please use a microphone because we're recording, okay? And this is a reminder, you are being recorded. And so you have given your consent. Be careful what you say.
Sorry to interrupt. Thanks, Frank, for your speech. I just want to comment that I personally have waited for 96 days to my visa granted by their administration. So and also a lot of cases like me, according to their explanations by their embassy, that was on average, for the visa granting will be take like within 3 or 4 weeks. So for me, like 3 months to get my visa. So really frustrating for me. And also a lot of cases from my classmates, from my friends. So I do have a feeling that there this government, this administration has gradually closing the door to, especially for the Chinese science community. So, our Chinese people, we have done the similar thing before in history. For last 200 or 300 years, our Qing dynasty has closed the door for almost 2 or 3 centuries. And you know what? The tragedy happens to our Chinese people. The Western powers has forced our border to open by weapons. And we lose their money, we lose their land. So I'm just curious, if their administration continues to do some strict limitations on their visa granting things, limiting the number of visiting scholars in universities here. So do you think their history will react in the future here in America?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me again offer a preface to my answer. Occasionally I have the opportunity to be part of U.S.-China convenings. I was part of the official United States delegation when Chinese Vice Premier Liu Yandong came to the United States a year and a half ago. I was on the American side of the table. Now, why do I say that? Because part of my appeal is it's bad for America. And as an American, I'm concerned that it's exactly as you point out, bad for America to be less open, to be closed, because history shows that closing your society, attempting to create an autarky, that's what North Korea is, it's generally disastrous. It does not lead to prosperity or enlightenment. It doesn't generate anything good when you forcibly close down your borders. I'll offer, so that's my preface. My concern is, as an American, for what's good for America, and what I would say is good for America is exemplified by California and San Francisco. What is it that has made the Bay Area great? It's welcoming migration. Or New York City. Some of you in this room are old enough to remember and know this history. In the 1970s, New York was about to go bankrupt, and Gerald Ford denied a federal bailout. The New York Post ran a headline, "President to New York City dropped dead," right? Now, what does that have to do with this? Everything. Because what saved New York City? Immigrants. New York City, which historically has been a nation of newcomers, there are 100 languages you can hear spoken on the sidewalks there, was revived by migration. And people who study this have done studies where they take 2 cities that are similar, demographically similar, and look at one that has heavy migration and one with low migration. And invariably, the high migration cities outperform the low migration cities. So New York City came roaring back. It's a fantastic place to be now, as the Bay Area is. These are places that people want to travel to. So I think you're absolutely right. Openness is ultimately beneficial for Americans. So even if you aren't concerned about the civil rights of Chinese researchers and scientists, that's fine. What I'm making is a utilitarian argument. It's just a pitch to Americans. It's in our national self-interest, and when I say our, I mean American. I'm an American, that we have this openness. That is our comparative advantage, and we should have confidence that the American way of life, that this openness, that if it's to continue to thrive, it has to live up to those ideals. Let me offer a thought, though. This is strictly a nonpartisan talk. Well, let me offer a thought. There is, because I want to be sympathetic, there is a reason I think we're facing this anxiety. We in the United States are facing this anxiety. China has done something that no other society on the face of the globe in recorded human history has done. it has, in the span of one generation, had sustained economic growth that lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty to a standard that's nowhere near the U.S. standard on the whole. You know, when we read about China, we're fooled. We read about Beijing and Shanghai. We don't read about inner provinces. We don't read about rural areas. We have the sense that, you know, all these young, wealthy, second generation wealthy in Shanghai are driving Maseratis around, right? And we don't really comprehend that gross domestic product, despite China being 4x the size of the US, still lags behind, and per capita income is way behind. So that even if China were to catch up, as it's virtually certain to do very soon, and surpass the US in GDP, that per capita income, it's going to be at least another generation or two, even assuming China deals with all the internal issues that it faces. But what's happened is this. So America is anxious because if you look at American history, since World War II, America vanquished the threat of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, America emerged as the sole global superpower. But now, China presents a credible threat, and people are worried, whether you're talking about the South China Sea or whatever else. People are worried, and this is why serious books are written. Graham Allison's book about the Thucydides trap, reintroducing a Greek philosopher whose name most people couldn't pronounce until a year ago. It's a serious, thoughtful, sobering book. For those of you who don't know the book, Graham Allison, Harvard professor, he wrote the classic study of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's erudite, someone who every poli-sci major reads, wrote this book talking about whether it is inevitable that there will be war between the United States and China. He studies multiple cases. In most, not all, in most cases, globally, when you have a stable, pre-existing hegemonic power and a rising power, you have real military conflict. I'm not talking about trade war. I'm not talking about Cold War. I'm talking about a shooting war where people die, right? So there is this sense. There is a real sense that even if America continues to do well, that we no longer speak of the starving children in China, right? And when we think about the young people coming here, where your careers will be successful, it may be in Shenzhen as much as in San Francisco. So that's what's animating this. I think you're absolutely right, this sort of circle the wagons mentality. I think we're out of time, maybe time for one very quick question.
Maybe a quick one.
Okay, a quick one in the back, if we get a mic, and then we'll wrap up. And I'm happy to linger and chit-chat.
Thank you, Professor Wu, for coming here to share your thoughts and perspectives with us. I'm John Nyan. I'm an MCB, also involved in the College of Engineering's joint venture with Tsinghua University in Shenzhen. So let me push back on a few things you said for the sake of argument. What you've kind of touched on but didn't really address is the tension that my family faced when my parents emigrated in the late 40s about this whole tension between do we assimilate or how do we maintain our identity? So with all due respect, rather than suggesting that people act more American, what can we do to educate our colleagues and the country at large? Maybe it's a hopeless effort to not look at us funny.
Right. Yeah.
Right?
No.
I mean, this is an ongoing tension, but you know, we're the victims. I mean, so what can we do to help educate the perpetrators of these biases?
I love your question. Invite me back. We're out of time. I'll do an entire talk, but I do want to say, I agree with you wholeheartedly. So I don't want you to think I'm just some US-born ABC who's all about being as white as I can be. I agree with what you have to say, and every time I visit China, I realize my mother was right. I should have paid attention in Chinese school. So I'll conclude on that thought. Thank you.
Well, let's thank our speaker very much for his interesting comments over the last hour.